My name is Martha Stoumen, and I'm really excited to be here today with all of you in the coffee world. It's a great kind of cross-contamination for me. So I am a California natural winemaker. I've been involved in making wine and growing grapes for the past 11 years. Winemaking is an interesting craft. Being a winemaker for the past 11 years could be likened to having opened a restaurant 11 days ago. So I think it's really important for the timeline of winemaking to be understood. You know, grapes only ripen once per year in the fall. So while a winemaker may produce a series of different wines each year, they really only have one chance per year to create their dishes. Furthermore, a dish might not be cooked or finished for many years. Wine is a complex matrix with transitions and transformations happening slowly and simultaneously. So it might be hard for a winemaker to discern whether a current characteristic in a wine was actually the effect of what they did 2 years ago. And if you're like me, you might even forget what you did 2 years ago. So in the meantime, you've gone ahead and you've created 2 more dishes from that very same vineyard, although the fruit was different because that's how nature works. So the big question is, how does a winemaker get from point A to point B and have any clue what point B is going to look like? Well, there's 2 basic approaches to that question: control over nature versus working with nature. Now, in industrialized conventional wine, the winemaker controls the entire path from point A to point B. And point B is the time at which that wine is put into bottle. The natural winemaker, on the other hand, will allow point B to be determined throughout the process. And we know that we ultimately might get close to point B, but wine is a living product, and once bottled, exists in the world beyond us. So for a natural winemaker, point B becomes a point in time when a consumer opens that bottle and enjoys it. So in reality, point B is many different points in time that exist long after we're gone. So natural wine often has the term movement attached to it. People ask me, are you part of the natural wine movement? And I rarely just answer yes. After that affirmation, I go ahead and explain why I think natural wine is important, how my wines fit in with the flavor spectrum of natural wines, also explaining that natural wine flavor spectrum is much broader than most people think. But I rarely get to the point that I want to lead with today when I'm explaining that, yes, I am a natural winemaker and I am part of that natural wine movement, which is that I am a part of that natural wine movement, but so are all of you. If you've ever paid attention or made a decision to buy grass-fed beef or fair trade coffee or cage-free eggs, craft beer, you get the point. If you've ever made a decision to purchase one of those qualitative products, then you are already part of the natural wine movement. So the natural wine movement is not an isolated campaign that's led by rogue winemakers, counterculture somms, and stylish consumers, although it does sound very sexy that way. But it is rather part of a natural progression in a larger movement towards greater transparency and environmental responsibility in what we consume. So we are all part of the collective history and culture that has produced the natural wine movement. Organic farming began in the early 1900s as a counterpoint to or pushback against the early beginnings of industrialized farming. And industrialized agriculture and processed food developed in tandem. So while industrialized ag often produced higher yields, it also produced crops that usually weren't as nutritious or flavorful. But processed foods could step in and go ahead and fill in where those flavor deficiencies were. So the point is, viticulture is agriculture, and viticulture has undergone the same industrialization that most agricultural systems have. And so what happens to wine at that point, knowing that wine is solely based on the flavors of the grape that comes into the winery? Well, you guessed it. We got really, really good at correcting for deficiencies in our base product. So just as we are all part of the collective history and culture that produced the natural wine movement, we are also all part of the collective history and culture that produced commercial processed wine, now dubbed conventional wine. And really, without conventional wine, us natural winemakers would have nothing to push back against. So, the talk is from grape to glass. Let's start talking about grape farming. Grapes are perennial crops, which mean that they live beyond 1 year, and if healthy, will produce fruit year after year of their adult lives. If a grapevine is well tended, it will live long beyond 100 years. So long beyond the time that the person planted it is still alive, which I think is pretty amazing. So I've gotten to work with 120-year-old grapevines. So I think, who's that person that planted this vine 120 years ago, which I think is really cool. So industrialized grape farming seeks control, and that control ultimately takes a toll on the vineyard. The average vine age for an industrialized vineyard is 30 years. So that's a big difference from that 120 I just talked about. Some of the techniques used in industrialized viticulture are things like soil fumigation, which is basically where they pump toxic vapor into the soil to sterilize it. Also, the wide use of herbicides in order to create what you see here as what they call the clean vineyard, where nothing else is growing besides the vines themselves. Additionally, the industrial farmer will select really shallow-rooted rootstocks, which are not drought tolerant. And this is as means to control vine vigor and yields through an irrigation line and liquid synthetic fertilizers. So the organic vineyard, on the other hand, and in particular, a dry farm grower will go ahead and choose more drought-tolerant rootstocks, which yield deeper roots that regulate themselves in terms of water and plant nutrients. And these deeper rootstocks are really drought-tolerant. They can exist at depths of 20 feet, 6 meters or more. It's very common. And in the organic vineyard, these roots not only regulate themselves, but because the soil is not sterilized, they take advantage of these really important symbiotic relationships with root colonizing bacteria and fungus, which also help bring up water and nutrients. And generally speaking, in the soil profile, the deeper you go, the more rich you get in mineral nutrients. So vines that are allowed to grow deep and access that mineral nutrient actually will have better tasting grapes. Those mineral nutrients really greatly impact flavor components in the finished grape. So while you can see here that there are plants growing in the vineyard other than grapevines, in an organic vineyard, this is actually a beneficial thing. So for the conventional vineyard, the argument is that there's too much competition with the vines themselves, which an industrial vineyard is trying to produce 8 to 12 tons per acre, generally speaking. And again, that shallow-rooted rootstock is actually in the same zone as the grass roots. But in an organic vineyard where the roots go much deeper than the plants themselves, and you're only trying to produce 3 to 4 tons per acre, it's really, the competition is not such a problem. And in fact, these plants that exist in the vineyard are really important for organic farming because a lot of beneficial insects live in them, and these beneficial insects often outcompete grapevine pests. So industrialized viticulture, you have to treat grapevine pests with insecticides because you don't have any biological controls like you do in an organic vineyard. So let's talk a little bit briefly about the growing season because It's important to understand kind of the biggest pathogen on a yearly basis for grapevines is fungus. So fungal pathogens really love grapes. It's necessary to do some sort of canopy management during the growing season then in order to increase airflow around the fruit. So in the industrial vineyard, generally machine leafers come through and they'll go ahead and pull leaves off in kind of a vacuuming motion or hedge the vines, which leaves some of the clusters totally exposed to the sun, creating sunburnt flavors, and then other clusters totally shaded, which means that they can produce green flavors or actually have mold in the flavor profile. So in the non-industrial vineyard, obviously it's a lot of time and labor to go through and select specific leaves and shoots, but the result is that you get a really nice dappled light on the fruit, you get even fruit ripening, and you get more consistent airflow. So you don't have to spray as many fungicides, or you can use softer chemistry. So grape farming, each farming system is unique, and I know some really excellent farmers that lightly irrigate, for example. I don't want to speak in extremes, but the point is, generally speaking, when you're working with nature rather than trying to control it, not only are you generally doing what's better for the environment, but you're actually producing better tasting fruit. So let's talk a bit about the transformation or the fermentation process, the winemaking process. For a natural winemaker, it's basic that the grape comes into the winery ready to make wine. That's kind of the tenet of natural winemaking. So a grape berry itself has it's a little winemaking kit. It has everything it needs to make wine. It has acidity, it has sugar, it has water, it has nutrients for yeast inside the berry, it has color and tannin in the skin, and then on the skin, on an intact, healthy grape berry that's not had any mildew, you'll have a rich natural bloom of yeast and bacteria. So I can't emphasize enough how important those farming decisions are leading up to that grape coming into the winery for natural wine, because that determines that entire winemaking kit come fall. Now, let's talk a little bit about fermentation. So for natural wine, what happens is once the grape berry is crushed and the juice comes into contact with the skin, that bloom of yeast and bacteria will start fermenting those sugars. And these are non-Saccharomyces yeast and bacteria, and what they'll do is they'll start creating a lot of flavors and a small amount of alcohol. So that's kind of what those microbes that come in on the grape skins are. They're more there for the rainbow flavors that they produce. After they produce a small amount of alcohol and alcohol gets high enough, they die off, and Saccharomyces species that are present in the cellar around us and in the air around us will continue and do the rest of fermentation. So natural wine, grapes, crushed, makes wine. Conventional wine, on the other hand, is a little bit of a different story. So the grapes come into the winery and the grapes are crushed. And then immediately after that, the juice is dosed with 50 parts per million or more of sulfur dioxide, which kills those non-Saccharomyces yeast species and bacteria. At that point, the juice is sent to a lab, and the lab analyzes, for things like sugar, tannin, acid, etc. And then the juice is adjusted within specific parameters, including yeast nutrient parameters. So at that point, things might be added to the juice like sugar, grape juice concentrate, tartaric acid, diammonium phosphate, which is a yeast nutrient, dead yeast matter, yeast micronutrients, etc. After that, the juice is inoculated with a single species of commercial Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which usually has known aromatic components to it. Once that yeast completes fermentation, if malolactic fermentation is desired, the wine is inoculated a second time with a specific lactic acid bacteria. At this point too, there might be things added like mega purple for coloring, or oak staves or oak powder for flavoring. So a little bit of a different story. Now, at the end of fermentation, is natural wine actually healthier for you than conventional wine? Not really. So this is more of a philosophical distinction. Is conventional wine a formulated product? Yes. Let's talk a little bit now about the aging and bottling, because that's where you might start having distinctions, and you might, some health issues may arise for certain people. So, in the aging of natural wine, it's usually wine with small amounts of sulfur added at certain points, and sometimes none. Conventional wine, on the other hand, there's a whole slew of things that are added during aging, again, just to create a more consistent product. The majority of those things are fining agents, so they are processing aids, and they're added to a wine, and if administered properly, trace amounts, if any, are actually in the finished wine. So some of those things include PVPP, which is a powder of plastic that's added to wines. Lysozyme, which is actually an enzyme that lyses gram-positive bacteria, so preventing malolactic fermentation from happening. And many people are allergic to lysozyme. Chitinase, another enzyme that's an allergen for many people. Milk protein, animal-derived gelatin, egg whites, fish air bladders, clay, to name a few. So those are all, besides lysozyme and chitinase, those are all fining agents. So they bind to certain things in wine and settle them out, and then are either racked off of that or filtered. There are other things that are added to conventional wine that, once added, break down over time. So one of those is Velcro, or dimethyl dicarbonate. And Velcro is added just before bottling and sterilizes the wine. It is something that wines that are dosed with Velcro are unsafe to drink 24 hours after dosing. And people who dose with Velcro have to wear full body protective gear, as in its unbroken down form is really corrosive on your skin and respiratory system. So all of these things are done in the name of creating a consistent product, whereas natural winemaking is not as concerned with this. We don't use these techniques because we're just willing to showcase the diversity of nature. So regardless of whether or not, it's hard to say how much of these processing aids and these things that are added to wine that break down over time are actually present in the finished wine. But I still argue for stricter labeling laws. I think it's really important. I think that things that are added to wine should be put on the label, and then if a winery decides that they want to test if there's any residual matter of those specific things, then they can also include that on the label. But I really think that the consumer should be allowed to decide if they want to drink a product that's, for instance, been, processed with animal-derived gelatin. That might be something you'd want to know. So ultimately, transparency empowers. Moving on from the fermentation and aging to the glass. So just as commercial wine has controlled the process from point A to point B, they're also, conventional winemakers are also ultimately controlling the end flavor profile. Read, a wine should consist of fruit flavors, oak flavors, alcohol, but really that transition from grape to wine should not be apparent in the finished wine. Natural winemakers, on the other hand, argue that if the imprint of fermentation is apparent in the finished wine, that's okay. And in fact, that's actually a good thing. It can create more interesting flavors. It can create more delicious wines in the long run. So sugar is never just converted to alcohol by yeast. And alcohol is never solely the natural stopping point in the chemistry of wine aging. And as such, natural wines can range from clean and fruity to wild and funky. And these wild and funky flavors have been getting a lot of press lately, both positive and negative in the natural wine world. But what I want to highlight is that natural wine really just expands the flavor spectrum. It adds to the flavor spectrum. It doesn't replace that flavor spectrum. So we also have fruit in our wines. We also occasionally even have oak in our wines, but usually that's been used to mask deficits in the base product. And I also want to add that natural wine generally does not just fit into the neat, box of red, white, and rosé. And that's not a box wine pun. It's just natural wine. I mean, we have just an amazing diversity of wine grapes available to us. And we also have a lot of different traditional winemaking techniques in the world. And, ultimately, if you're letting nature kind of lead you on the way towards point B, you're never going to fit neatly into 3 categories. So, in conclusion, I would like to say that speaking from my culture, as Americans, we've allowed, we've decided recently that dry-aged, grass-fed beef belongs alongside the softer flavors of grain-fed beef, and that, spicy arugula and bitter mustards belong in the salad just as much as the iceberg lettuce wedge. So I think that these sort of flavor analogies can be drawn no matter what culture you're coming from, and I really think that I just argue that wine should be given the same open-mindedness that, ultimately expands our world. So, thank you.